The story of Brandon Lawson is a Texas mystery that begins not with a stranger, but with a familiar argument in a family home. On the night of August 8, 2013, in San Angelo, a city about 250 miles south of Dallas, 26-year-old Brandon had a heated disagreement with his longtime girlfriend, Ledessa Lofton. The couple had been together since their school days. They met when Brandon was in junior high and Ledessa was a sophomore. He asked her for her number, and from that moment, they were nearly inseparable. Over the next 10 years, they built a life and a family, raising 3 children together, with Brandon also having a 4th child from a previous relationship. He was a father, a partner, and a provider. But that night, the pressures of that life boiled over. Brandon had not come home from work the previous night, and Ledessa was angry, not just about his absence, but because she had discovered he had started using methamphetamine again. He had been clean for 6 months, but the stress of working 60 hours a week in the oil fields, combined with the demands of a newborn at home, had become too much. Just days before, he had called his own brother Kyle to ask where he could find the drug, mentioning that he had already passed the drug test for a new job and was in the clear. Kyle had urged him not to start again, but Brandon insisted he would only do a little. This relapse would set the stage for the night's events. Needing to cool off from the argument with Ledessa, Brandon left his house at approximately 11:55 p.m. His initial plan, documented in a phone call to his father just 1 minute before he left, was to make the long drive to his parents' house in Crowley, near Fort Worth, a journey that, according to Google Maps, would have taken him about 3 hours and 40 minutes. He got into his truck and drove away from his home, his family, and the life he knew, heading into a darkness from which he would never return. As Brandon Lawson drove away from San Angelo, the night began to unfold through a series of frantic phone calls, creating a timeline that would later become the central piece of the entire investigation. The first call was to his father, Bradley, at 11:54 p.m., where he outlined his plan to drive to Crowley. But just 6 minutes later, at midnight, his girlfriend Ledessa called him, concerned about the long drive, especially given his state of mind. She pleaded with him to just go to his brother Kyle's house, which was less than a mile from their own home. It was a reasonable request, an attempt to de-escalate the situation. After this call, Ledessa took her cell phone out to their van to charge it because Brandon had taken the plug charger from the house. Starting at 12:34 a.m., Brandon began trying to call Ledessa back. He called her 3 more times, but because her phone was charging in the vehicle, she never heard it ring. He was trying to reach out, but he was met with silence. This is when his calls took a desperate turn. With no answer from Ledessa, he called his brother Kyle. He first told Kyle he needed gas, his truck was running on fumes, but then the story shifted dramatically. His voice was charged with fear. He told Kyle that he was being chased. He specifically said, and this is a direct quote, "3 Mexicans are chasing me out of town." When Kyle, understandably confused, asked for clarification, Brandon insisted that he meant people from his own neighborhood, implying that Ledessa had somehow gotten them to chase him. He further claimed that one of these pursuers had already been pulled over by a state trooper, but that 2 others were still after him. Kyle, aware of his brother's recent meth use, directly asked him if he was hallucinating. Brandon firmly denied it, insisting the danger was real. He was on US Highway 277, a quiet 2-lane road near the community of Bronte, and he was utterly convinced he was not alone.
While Brandon Lawson was stranded and terrified on the side of Highway 277, his brother Kyle was springing into action, setting in motion a rescue effort that would become a race against time. At 12:40 a.m., immediately after his disturbing call with Brandon, Kyle phoned Ledessa to let her know her boyfriend was stranded and out of gas. He, along with his girlfriend Audrey and their 4-year-old son, quickly got into their car and headed towards Brandon and Ledessa's house to pick up a gas can. When they arrived, Ledessa, who was in the shower, had already left the empty gas can on the porch for them. Kyle did not fill the can at this point because he couldn't afford the gas. His plan was to first find Brandon, then drive him to a station, fill the can, and return to the truck. Meanwhile, Brandon's isolation and panic were reaching a peak. At 12:48 a.m., he tried calling Ledessa again with no answer. Then at 12:50 a.m., while waiting for his brother in the oppressive darkness, he made the decision that would forever define his case. He called 911. The call was chaotic and difficult to decipher, a jumble of gasped phrases and background noise. He told the dispatcher he was in a field. He stated his truck had run out of gas. He mentioned there was 1 car there and said something critical yet ambiguous. "I ran into him." He pleaded with the operator to hurry. When she asked if he needed an ambulance, he was clear. "No, I need the cops." She then asked the pivotal question, "Is anybody hurt?" and the call abruptly cut off. This truncated 911 call, less than a minute long, left authorities with more questions than answers. The line went dead before he could explain, leaving his words to echo forever in a vacuum of uncertainty. The minutes following the 911 call were a whirlwind of failed connections and escalating chaos, painting a picture of a man whose world was collapsing in real time. At 12:51 a.m., just after his call to emergency services disconnected, Kyle tried to call Brandon back, only to get his voicemail. At 12:54 a.m., Brandon, still waiting, made another attempt to reach LaDessa, but again, her phone was charging in the van and she didn't hear it. At 12:57 a.m., in a sign of his increasing desperation, he called his neighbor, a move outside of his immediate family, but it didn't go through. At 12:58 a.m., he tried to call his brother Kyle 3 times, but these calls failed to connect properly. When calls between the two brothers did manage to go through, Kyle later reported that Brandon would only utter a few words before suddenly hanging up, as if he was afraid of being overheard or could not stay on the line. During this exact same window of time, Brandon's neighbor, likely concerned by the missed call, tried calling him back as well, but the calls also failed to connect. The cell service in that rural area was proving to be a major obstacle, fracturing the communication lifeline Brandon so desperately needed. It was also around this time that a critical external observation was made. A passing motorist driving along the otherwise deserted Highway 277 noticed Brandon's black Chevrolet Silverado. The truck was parked in a way that caught the driver's attention. Its rear end was sticking out over the white line of the road, posing a potential hazard. This prompted the concerned citizen to call 911 to report an abandoned vehicle. This separate, independent 911 call is what initially dispatched law enforcement to the scene. At 1:04 a.m., the 911 dispatcher who had spoken to Brandon tried to call him back, left a message when he didn't answer, and tried again. The lines of communication were buzzing, but none were successfully linking Brandon to the help he was pleading for. He was trapped in a perfect storm of bad luck, poor cell service, and his own deteriorating situation.
The climax of the search arrived at around 1:10 a.m., but it brought confusion instead of resolution. Kyle Lawson finally pulled up behind his brother's abandoned truck on Highway 277. He found the vehicle undamaged, its doors unlocked, and the windows rolled halfway down. Brandon's keys and cell phone were nowhere to be found. It was a scene that suggested a sudden, hurried exit. Almost simultaneously, a Coke County Sheriff's deputy, Chief Deputy Brandon Neal, arrived on the scene. He was there in response to the motorist's call about the abandoned vehicle, not yet aware of Brandon's own frantic 911 call. As the deputy's cruiser pulled up, Kyle was miraculously on the phone with his brother. Brandon was hiding somewhere in the vast, dark fields surrounding the road. He told Kyle he could see the police lights. In a state of sheer panic, he urged his brother to flee, using their pre-established code phrase, "one-time run," which meant to run from the police. Kyle, trying to be the voice of reason, assured his brother he had done nothing wrong and had no reason to run. He urged Brandon to simply walk out of the field and explain the situation. Brandon's response was a sharp, frustrated, and final retort. "Where is your pride, motherfucker?" Then, the line went dead. Those 6 words were the last Kyle or anyone in his family would ever hear from Brandon. The conversation was over. Deputy Neal approached Kyle and asked if he was the one who called about the truck. Kyle explained he was the brother, that Brandon had run out of gas and had likely started walking. He asked the deputy if he could drive along the road to look for him. Deputy Neal stated that he had not seen anyone walking on his drive to the location, implying Brandon could not have gone in that direction. At this point, Kyle was operating with incomplete information. He did not know Brandon had specifically called for the police, making his brother's decision to hide from the very help he had summoned a baffling and heartbreaking contradiction. The rescue mission had reached its endpoint, only to find a void.
With the deputies still on the scene, Kyle and Audrey refused to give up. They began their own desperate search, driving slowly along the dark stretches of Highway 277, their voices cutting through the still night air as they called out Brandon's name. They shouted into the darkness, pleading for him to show himself, assuring him that they were there to help. They continued to send text messages, hoping the screen would light up in the gloom and guide them to him. But the only response was the sound of crickets in the wind. The situation was further complicated by the presence of their young son. The 4-year-old was growing hungry and restless in the back seat, the late hour and tension taking their toll. Forced to pause the search, Kyle drove to a nearby cash dispenser, withdrew some money, and then went to get food for his son and a small amount of gas for their own car. Determined to expand the effort, Kyle then drove to his friend Chris's house, waking him up and enlisting his help. The two men then drove back to the spot where Brandon's truck had been parked. By this time, Deputy McNeil had left the location. With the police gone, Kyle, Audrey, and Chris resumed their slow drive along the highway, their calls for Brandon becoming more urgent. They then went to a gas station, put a mere $5 worth of fuel into the gas can, all they could afford, and returned to Brandon's truck. Kyle placed the can in the bed of the truck, yelling out to his brother, telling him what he had done and that the police were gone. From there, Kyle continued the agonizing ritual, driving up and down the same stretch of road, his headlights sweeping across the empty fields. Then at 3 a.m., a definitive silence fell. Brandon's cell phone, his only tether to the world, either was turned off or its battery died. The constant frantic pinging that had charted his fear throughout the night stopped. The digital trail went cold, and the physical search for that night was over. The first light of dawn on August 9th revealed the stark reality of the situation. Brandon Lawson was gone. Kyle returned to the site of his brother's truck at daybreak, conducting a more thorough visual search of the immediate area in the daylight. He found no trace of Brandon. The only potential clue was a single spot under a tree near where the truck had been parked. The grass was flattened, as if someone had sat there within direct eyesight of the road. It was a subtle sign, but it hinted that Brandon had indeed been close by, watching the events unfold with his brother and the deputy just hours before. Later that morning, at around 9 a.m., the Coke County Sheriff's Office officially towed Brandon's Silverado away. Critically, the vehicle was never processed for evidence or forensically searched by law enforcement at that time. When LaDessa called the police department to formally report that they could not find Brandon, the official response was not one of immediate alarm for a man in potential danger. Instead, upon running his information, they discovered Brandon had an outstanding warrant for a probation violation related to previous drug charges. This discovery dramatically shifted the official perspective. They began to suspect that Kyle had not been entirely truthful during his interaction with Deputy McNeil on the roadside. They theorized that Kyle, knowing about the warrant, had perhaps helped his brother flee to avoid arrest. This suspicion cast a shadow on the family's genuine distress. To clear his name and assist the investigation, Kyle voluntarily submitted to not one, but 2 polygraph tests. The first test focused on whether he had helped Brandon disappear, asking if he had given him a ride or knew his current whereabouts. The second, more devastating test asked directly if he had hurt or killed his brother. Kyle passed both examinations conclusively, the results officially clearing him of any involvement in Brandon's disappearance or harm. Despite this, the initial official theory leaned heavily on the idea of a drug-fueled accident. They conducted extensive searches of the rugged terrain using airplanes, helicopters with thermal imaging, and 6 different cadaver dogs. LaDessa, refusing to rely solely on the authorities, hired a private investigator who led a team of 10 volunteers. Yet all these efforts yielded the same result: nothing. Brandon had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a legacy of questions and a family trapped in a nightmare of not knowing.
For nearly 9 years, the disappearance of Brandon Lawson remained a painful, open wound for his family and a haunting cold case for the true crime community. The Help Find Brandon Lawson Facebook page, managed tirelessly by his loved ones, became a digital memorial and a hub for coordinating search parties and sharing tips, all while keeping Brandon's memory alive. The official investigation had largely grown cold, with the prevailing theory still suggesting he had succumbed to the elements in a drug-impaired state somewhere in the vast, unforgiving Texas landscape. His family, however, never wavered in their belief that he deserved to be found and brought home. Kyle Lawson often spoke to media defending his brother's character, stating, "My brother may have been a felon and might have messed with drugs and he might have relapsed, but he loved his children. He took care of his children. He was a good person. He wasn't some dope fiend living on the streets." This unwavering determination is what ultimately led to a breakthrough. In early February of 2022, a new organized search party, coordinated through the family's persistent efforts, was conducted in the area surrounding Highway 277. On Friday, February 4th, at approximately 2 p.m., the family's Facebook page posted a monumental update. The search party had discovered clothing scattered in a remote area, and the items were consistent with what Brandon was wearing on the night he vanished: a plaid shirt and white socks. Authorities, including the Texas Rangers, were immediately contacted. The Rangers secured the scene and conducted a meticulous follow-up search. This led to the discovery of human remains not far from where the clothing was found. The family's statement was both heartbreaking and resolute. They expressed that in their hearts they knew the remains were Brandon's, though they acknowledged that definitive DNA confirmation could take up to 6 months. They ended the post with a powerful sense of closure, stating they were extremely grateful that they can lay Brandon to rest and know that he is home. The long, agonizing wait for answers was finally over. The mystery of his location was solved, allowing his family to begin the process of true mourning and grant Brandon Cole Lawson a peaceful, final resting place. What do you guys think happened to Brandon Lawson? I would like to hear from you in the comments. Thank you for watching. Do well to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy quick, deep dives like this one. We will be dropping a very mind-boggling episode soon. Until then, stay well and stay safe.